The Grand Hall of the Galactic Senate was always a place of order, tradition, and careful diplomacy. Dozens of alien species gathered here to negotiate, discuss, and maintain peace among the stars. It was a place where a single mistake could turn into a political disaster. Lieutenant Jake Carter, a representative of Earth's growing influence in the galaxy, was well aware of this fact. He had been sent to assist in diplomatic efforts, to prove that humanity was capable, respectful, and worthy of standing among the stars. He thought he was doing a good job. Until today. It all happened so fast. One moment, he was walking through the hall, carrying a datapad filled with reports. The next, a towering alien, Lady Keshtal of the Exal Vorin, stumbled slightly as a service drone zipped past her. Without thinking, Jake reacted on instinct. He reached out. His hand barely touched her arm, steadying her before she could fall. A simple, natural act of kindness. Then the hall fell into absolute silence. Dozens of eyes, from all different species, turned toward them. Shocked whispers spread like wildfire. The glowing patterns on Keshtal's dark exoskeletal armor flashed rapidly. First bright blue, then shifting to a deep crimson. Jake blinked, confused. You okay?" Keshtal did not respond. Her 4 golden eyes stared at him in utter disbelief. Her mandibles twitched slightly, and her clawed hands curled into fists. Then, from across the hall, an Exal Vorin elder let out a sharp, hissing breath. "He has touched her." The whispers became louder. Some aliens gasped. Others exchanged knowing looks, as if something terrible had just happened. Jake looked around, completely lost. "What's going on?" he asked, frowning. A smaller alien, one of the Relani diplomats, leaned in and whispered, "Oh, human, you don't know, do you?" Jake's confusion deepened. He turned back to Keshtal, who still hadn't moved. Her glowing patterns pulsed with a mixture of shock, fury, and something else he couldn't quite understand. Then, finally, she spoke. Human. Her voice was low, controlled, but there was clear tension underneath. "Do you have any idea what you have just done?" Jake swallowed. Saved you from falling." The room tensed even more. Some aliens shook their heads. Others looked at Jake with something between amusement and sympathy. Keshtal took a slow step forward. Despite being nearly a foot taller than him, her movements were precise and graceful, like a predator deciding whether to strike. "In Exal Vorin culture," she said, her voice cold, "a touch in public is not a simple act. It is an invitation." Jake frowned. Invitation for what? The moment he asked, he saw it. The way her glowing patterns pulsed in a specific rhythm. The way the other Exal Vorins watched with intense focus. The way the elders whispered among themselves. Realization hit him like a freight train. "Oh," Jake muttered. "Oh no." Keshtal's eyes narrowed. "Yes." Another voice, deep and commanding, rang through the hall. An elder, standing at the top of the Senate chamber, raised his staff. "The law is clear," he declared. "A touch, given in public, is a formal declaration of bonding intent. The trials must now begin." Jake stared at him. "The what?" Keshtal let out a slow, controlled breath. "By our sacred law, if a warrior is touched in public, the one who touched them must prove themselves worthy through the trials of mating." Jake nearly choked on air. "You've got to be kidding me." The elder slammed his staff against the floor. "The law does not jest, human." The reality of the situation started sinking in. He, Jake Carter, had, by complete accident, triggered some ancient alien tradition that now demanded he either go through mysterious, dangerous trials or what? He turned to Keshtal, who was still looking at him with unreadable eyes. "Listen," he said, raising his hands in surrender. "This is clearly a misunderstanding. I didn't know about your customs. I didn't mean to." "Intent does not matter," Keshtal interrupted, her voice firm. "The law is absolute." Jake groaned, rubbing his temples. This was not how he expected his day to go. Okay, all right. Let's just take a second here. What happens if I don't do these trials? Kestrel's mandibles clicked. Then you will be exiled from Salvoran space forever. That made Jake pause. Humanity was still new to the galactic stage. Losing access to Salvoran space, one of the most powerful and influential territories, would be a diplomatic disaster. Earth couldn't afford that kind of mistake. He sighed, looking around at the dozens of alien diplomats watching, waiting for his response. Then he looked back at Keshtal. The Salvoran warrior's posture was stiff, tense. She clearly didn't want this any more than he did. And yet there was something else in her expression. Something challenging. Jake exhaled sharply. Fine. He crossed his arms. I'll do your trials. The room erupted in murmurs. Some aliens seemed shocked. Others looked amused. The elder simply nodded. Keshtal's eyes narrowed. You are a fool. Jake shrugged. Wouldn't be the first time. For the first time, Keshtal's glowing patterns flickered strangely, almost like amusement. The elder raised his staff again. The trials of mating shall begin at first light. As Jake was led away to be briefed on what awaited him, one thought kept running through his mind. How does this stuff keep happening to me? Jake Carter sat on the edge of a stone bench in the Salvoran preparation chamber, staring at the wall. His mind was still trying to process what had just happened. A touch, a simple, harmless touch, and now he was bound by some ancient alien law to prove himself worthy as a mate. It sounded like a bad joke. The heavy doors slid open with a quiet hiss. Jake turned his head and saw Keshtal enter the chamber, her tall, armored figure moving with calculated grace. Her golden eyes locked onto him, glowing slightly under the chamber's soft lighting. She did not look happy. Human, she said, crossing her arms. You should not have accepted. Jake let out a tired sigh. Yeah. And what was I supposed to do? Let my whole species get banned from your territory because I tried to help. Keshtal's mandibles twitched, a sign of annoyance. This is not your fight. You had an option to walk away. Jake scoffed. Sure. And that option would have made me a coward in front of every diplomat in that room. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I don't run from my mistakes, even if they happen by accident. Keshtal studied him for a moment. The glowing bioluminescent patterns on her exoskeletal armor pulsed in a slow rhythm, as if she were processing something. You are stubborn, she finally said. Jake smirked. Yeah, I get that a lot. She let out a slow exhale before stepping closer. The first trial begins at dawn. You will not last long. Jake raised an eyebrow. That sounds like a challenge. It is a fact, Keshtal corrected. The trials of mating are designed to test physical strength, endurance, and skill. The first challenge takes place on the molten moon of Xorvarn, a place where even trained Salvoran warriors struggle to survive. Jake tilted his head. Molten moon. As in lava, heat, and extreme temperatures. Yes. Jake shrugged. I've worked in worse conditions. Keshtal narrowed her eyes. You are not taking this seriously. Jake stood up, stretching his arms. Look, I get it. You don't think I can handle it. But I've been in tough spots before. Earth isn't exactly a gentle planet, you know. Keshtal remained silent for a moment. Then she turned sharply, her armor making a faint clicking noise as she moved. You will see soon enough, human. And when you fail, I expect you to accept your defeat with honor. Jake grinned. Let's just see who surprises who first. Keshtal stopped at the door, but did not turn back. Her glowing patterns flickered again, this time, in a pattern Jake hadn't seen before. Then she left. Jake exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. Molten moon, huh? Well, he'd survived worse. Probably. The first trial begins. The next morning, Jake stood on the edge of a landing platform, looking down at the molten moon of Xorvarn below. The surface glowed with streaks of molten rock, rivers of lava cutting through jagged cliffs and cracked obsidian plains. Thick clouds of heat shimmered in the air. "All right," Jake muttered to himself. "No big deal. Just a moon made of fire." Beside him, Keshtal adjusted her gear. Unlike Jake, she wore a specialized cooling exosuit designed to handle the extreme temperatures. Jake, on the other hand, only had his standard-issue survival gear. She glanced at him. "Are all humans this reckless?" Jake smirked. "Probably." The Exalvoran elder overseeing the trial raised his staff. "The first trial is simple. You must reach the obsidian pillar at the center of the molten plains. If you survive and make it there before sunset, you pass." Jake rolled his shoulders. "Sounds easy enough." Keshtal let out a sharp breath. "You truly do not understand, do you?" Jake grinned. "Nope." Then he jumped off the platform. The fall wasn't too high, but the heat hit him instantly. His boots landed on hot, cracked stone, and even through his gear, he could feel the overwhelming warmth pressing against his skin. Keshtal landed beside him, her movements precise and controlled. "Stay close if you wish to survive," she said. Jake chuckled. "I was gonna say the same thing to you." Keshtal ignored him and started moving forward. The landscape was harsh. Every few steps, the ground shifted, revealing pockets of bubbling lava. The air was thick, making it hard to breathe. Jake quickly realized that his biggest enemy wasn't just the heat, it was dehydration. He could already feel sweat dripping down his back. Keshtal noticed his struggle. "You should not have come," she said. "Humans are not built for this." Jake wiped his forehead and kept walking. "You keep saying that, but I'm still here, aren't I?" Keshtal watched him for a moment, then turned away. "Do not slow me down." For hours, they made their way across the burning landscape. At one point, a magma fissure erupted in front of them, forcing them to leap across a newly formed lava flow. Jake barely made it, landing hard on the other side. Keshtal landed gracefully, turning back to him with a slight tilt of her head. "You are more durable than I expected." Jake smirked. "Told you. Humans are full of surprises." As the sun began to set, the obsidian pillar finally came into view. But just as they were about to reach it, the ground beneath Jake collapsed. He fell, straight toward a pool of molten rock. For a split second, everything slowed. The heat surged up around him. He braced himself for impact. Then, a strong hand grabbed his arm. Keshtal's grip was like iron. With a powerful pull, she yanked him away from the collapsing ground, pulling him up onto solid stone. They both landed, breathing heavily. Keshtal looked at him, her glowing patterns shifting into an unreadable color. "Foolish human," she muttered, but there was no anger in her voice, only something close to curiosity. Jake coughed. "Told you. I'd make it." They sat there for a moment, the heat of the molten moon still raging around them. But neither spoke. For the first time since this whole mess started, Keshtal looked at Jake not with irritation, but with something else. Something unexpected. And Jake, he just grinned. This was getting interesting. Jake Carter lay on the scorching ground of the molten moon of Hauervarn, breathing heavily. His muscles ached, his skin was covered in sweat, and his heart was still pounding from the near fall into molten rock. Beside him, Keshtal sat in complete silence. Her golden eyes studied him, her glowing patterns shifting between colors Jake couldn't quite understand yet. Finally, she spoke. "You are not weak." Jake let out a breathless chuckle. "Gee, thanks." Keshtal tilted her head. "I expected you to collapse hours ago. Humans are not built for such extreme conditions." Jake wiped his forehead. "Yeah, well, humans are stubborn." He glanced at her. "You're not bad yourself. Nice save, by the way." She narrowed her eyes slightly. "It would have been dishonorable to let you fall." Jake smirked. "I'll take that as a you're welcome." Keshtal's mandibles twitched, but she didn't reply. Instead, she stood up, dusting off her armor. We must reach the obsidian pillar before the sun fully sets. The trial is not over yet. Jake groaned as he pushed himself up. His legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to move. All right, lead the way, warrior princess. Kestrel gave him a sharp look. I am not a princess. Jake grinned. You've got the whole royalty attitude, though. She huffed but said nothing as they continued walking. Reaching the pillar. The final stretch to the obsidian pillar was a challenge. The ground became more unstable, the heat more intense. Every step felt heavier, like the air itself was trying to pull them down. But Jake refused to stop. Kestrel, despite her initial doubts, started to notice something. This human refused to surrender. Even when his body was pushed past its limits, even when the environment was against him, he kept moving. She had fought alongside many warriors in her lifetime. Some strong, some skilled, some disciplined, but none had this strange human persistence. It was fascinating. Finally, as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, they stepped onto the obsidian pillar, a massive, jagged spire of black stone standing tall above the molten plains. The moment they touched the platform, a deep gong echoed through the sky. The trial was complete. Jake collapsed onto the smooth stone. Ha! We did it. Kestrel stood tall, watching the darkening horizon. Then she turned to Jake and gave a slow nod. You have passed the first trial. Jake lifted a hand. High five. Kestrel frowned. What? Jake grinned, waving his hand. It's a human thing. You slap hands to celebrate. Kestrel stared at him for a moment before hesitantly lifting her clawed hand. Jake gently smacked his palm against hers. Her glowing patterns flickered in an unfamiliar sequence. Strange. Jake laughed. Yeah. Well, welcome to human culture. A new perspective. That night, they sat around a small plasma heat shield, a device keeping them warm against the freezing night winds of the molten moon. Kestrel sat in silence, staring at the flames. Her mind was filled with thoughts she didn't expect to have. Jake Carter had survived. Not only that, he had proven himself. He had no cooling armor, no specialized training for this environment. Yet he had kept up with her. He had shown strength, resilience, and humor. She had misjudged him. You have my respect, human. Jake blinked at her. Wow, wasn't expecting that. Kestrel's mandibles twitched. I was wrong about you. You are more than a simple diplomat. Jake smirked. Glad you're finally seeing my charm. She exhaled sharply. Do not push your luck. Jake laughed, leaning back on his arms. So, what's next? Kestrel looked toward the sky. The second trial. Jake groaned. Let me guess. It's even harder. She nodded. Yes. And this time, you will not just be fighting the elements. Jake raised an eyebrow. What does that mean? Kestrel's golden eyes glowed in the darkness. It means, human, that now you must fight me. Jake stared at her. Then he grinned. This just keeps getting better. Jake Carter stood on the obsidian pillar, staring at Kestrel. Her golden eyes glowed under the twin moons above them, her bioluminescent markings shifting into a fierce pattern. You're serious? Jake asked, crossing his arms. I just barely survived a burning wasteland, and now I have to fight you. Kestrel gave a slow nod. The second trial is a test of combat. A true mate must prove they can stand against a Xalvoran warrior. Jake sighed. Of course, because nothing about this can be simple. Kestrel stepped forward. You may forfeit if you wish. Jake smirked. And let you win that easily. Nah. Let's do this. She studied him for a moment, then tapped a button on her wrist. The obsidian pillar rumbled, and the ground beneath them shifted. The platform expanded, creating a circular arena surrounded by glowing red energy barriers. Jake's grin faded slightly. Oh great. They made it official. The fight begins. Kestrel raised her hands, taking a battle stance. I will not hold back, she warned. Jake rolled his shoulders. Didn't expect you to. A loud gong sounded. The fight had begun. Kestrel moved first. Fast. In the blink of an eye, she closed the distance between them, her clawed hand slashing toward Jake's side. Jake barely dodged, twisting out of the way. "Whoa, you don't waste time, huh?" She didn't answer. Instead, she attacked again, this time with a powerful kick. Jake reacted purely on instinct, raising his arms to block. The impact sent him skidding backward. "Okay, that hurt," he muttered. Kestrel tilted her head. "Your defense is weak." Jake grinned. "Yeah, well, you're the one picking a fight with a guy who grew up playing street basketball instead of space warrior training." She rushed at him again. This time, Jake didn't dodge. He ducked low, sweeping his leg under her. Kestrel stumbled slightly but quickly recovered, leaping back with surprising agility. She looked at him with something close to approval. "You learn fast," she admitted. Jake shrugged. "Gotta adapt if I want to survive." A battle of strength and wit. For the next few minutes, the two traded blows. Kestrel was stronger, faster, and more experienced, but Jake was unpredictable. He didn't fight like a Xalvoran warrior. He didn't rely on brute strength. Instead, he used quick movements, feints, and unexpected counters. At one point, she lunged at him, claws aiming for his shoulder. Jake dodged at the last second and tapped her forehead with 2 fingers. "Boop," he said with a grin. Kestrel blinked in shock. Then she snarled, eyes narrowing. "You mock me." Jake laughed. "No, I just like messing with serious people." She charged again, this time faster than before. Jake barely dodged, rolling to the side. His breathing was getting heavier. His muscles ached. He could tell she was holding back just enough to avoid breaking him, but she wasn't making this easy. "Your endurance is impressive," Kestrel admitted. Jake wiped sweat from his brow. "Yeah, well, my arms say otherwise." She exhaled slowly. "Then let us end this." Before Jake could respond, she moved, faster than before. He had no time to dodge. In an instant, Kestrel grabbed his arm, spun him around, and threw him to the ground. Jake hit the stone hard, the air knocked out of his lungs. Before he could move, she pinned him down, one knee pressing against his chest. Her clawed hand stopped just inches from his throat. The gong sounded. The fight was over. A surprising conclusion. Jake lay on the ground, staring up at Kestrel. "So, I'm guessing I lost." She tilted her head, watching him closely. "You did not win." Jake chuckled. "Yeah, that sounds about right." She stood up, stepping back and offering him a hand. After a moment, Jake took it, letting her pull him to his feet. "You lasted longer than I expected," she admitted. Jake smirked. "I get that a lot." She studied him for a moment, her glowing patterns shifting again. Then she spoke words that surprised even herself. "You have earned my respect, human." Jake blinked. "Wait, what?" Kestrel crossed her arms. "You lack strength, but you compensate with speed and adaptability. You lack experience, but you learn quickly. And you do not give up, even when defeat is certain." Jake scratched the back of his head. "Well, when you put it like that, sounds like I'm not completely useless." Kestrel's mandibles twitched. "No, you are not." Jake grinned. "Wow, a compliment. Guess I must be special." She rolled her eyes. "Do not let it go to your head." Jake chuckled. "No promises." The energy barriers around the arena faded, and the platform returned to normal. Kestrel turned toward the horizon. "The third trial begins soon. Rest while you can." Jake sighed. "Another trial. Of course. Can't wait to see what's next." Kestrel hesitated for a moment. Then she said something unexpected. "This trial will not be about strength." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what's it about then?" She looked at him, her golden eyes unreadable. "A test of the mind." Jake groaned. "Great. And here I was hoping for a nap." Keshtal's patterns flickered again, almost like amusement. As the two warriors sat down to rest, one thing was clear. This human was proving to be more than just a mistake. He was becoming something else entirely. Jake Carter sat on a stone ledge, rubbing his sore arms. The fight with Keshtal had left him exhausted, but at least he was still in one piece. Keshtal stood nearby, staring at the horizon, her glowing patterns shifting in slow rhythmic waves. Jake sighed. "So, this next trial. You said it's a test of the mind." She turned her golden gaze toward him. "Yes, it is the most important trial of all." Jake raised an eyebrow. "More important than fighting?" She nodded. "A warrior's strength means nothing if they lack wisdom." Jake leaned back on his arms. "All right, sounds reasonable. What do I have to do?" "Solve an alien puzzle. Memorize a 1,000-year-old history book." Keshtal's mandibles twitched. "No, you must navigate the path of shadows." Jake sat up. "Sounds mysterious." She crossed her arms. "It is a mental challenge. The path of shadows is an ancient Salvoran tradition. It will test your mind, your emotions, and your true self." Jake frowned. "So, what? Is it a riddle or something?" Keshtal's expression remained unreadable. "You will see." Entering the path of shadows. As the twin moons rose higher in the sky, Keshtal led Jake toward a massive stone archway. Strange symbols glowed along its edges, shifting and pulsing like they were alive. Jake stopped in front of it. "Okay, this definitely looks like something out of a sci-fi movie." Keshtal placed a hand on the arch. "Once you step through, you will face visions, your own thoughts, memories, and fears. The path of shadows reveals what is hidden inside you." Jake exhaled. "Great, I get to fight my own brain." She turned to him. "If you fail, the trial is over." Jake smirked. "And if I win?" Keshtal hesitated, then said softly, "Then you will prove yourself worthy." Jake's grin faded slightly. He could tell this meant more than just passing a test. It was about honor, tradition, and something personal to Keshtal. Taking a deep breath, he stepped through the arch. The first vision. Earth's ghosts. The moment Jake crossed the threshold, the world around him shifted. He was no longer on the molten moon. Instead, he stood in the middle of a ruined city. Earth. Buildings lay in rubble. Smoke curled into the sky. The distant sound of sirens echoed through the air. Jake's heart clenched. He knew this place. It was his hometown. And in front of him stood his father. "Dad?" Jake whispered. His father turned, his face unreadable. "You left, Jake." Jake took a step forward. "No, You abandoned your home. You ran off into space while the people here struggled." Jake clenched his fists. "That's not true. You never belonged out there," his father said, his voice colder now. "You should have stayed." The words hit deep. Jake had spent years wondering if he had made the right choice. Leaving Earth, joining the diplomatic corps, traveling to the stars. It had all felt like an adventure. But had he truly abandoned his home? Was he running away? The ruins around him trembled, and shadows crept closer, whispering doubts into his mind. Jake gritted his teeth. "No," he said firmly. "I didn't abandon Earth. I left to build something better. To make sure we had a place out there." The shadows hissed. His father's form flickered. Then the vision shattered, and Jake found himself standing in darkness once more. The second vision. Keshtal's doubt. A new scene formed around him. This time, he was back on the obsidian pillar, but something was wrong. Keshtal stood in front of him, her glowing patterns dim and fading. "You will never be strong enough," she said. Her voice was hollow, empty. Jake frowned. "What?" She took a step forward, her golden eyes cold. "You are weak, Jake Carter. A human among warriors. You do not belong in my world." Jake felt a pang in his chest. He had fought so hard to prove himself. But had it ever been enough? No, he said, shaking his head. You don't get to decide that. Kestrel's expression didn't change. Then who does? Jake clenched his fists. I do. The vision cracked, dissolving into dust. Emerging from the shadows, Jake gasped as he stumbled back into reality, his head spinning. The stone archway was behind him. The path of shadows was over. Kestrel stood waiting. Her expression, usually unreadable, held something close to concern. You were in there for a long time, she said. Jake took a deep breath, steadying himself. Felt like a lifetime. Kestrel studied him. Did you face the truth? Jake met her gaze. Yeah, and I didn't let it break me. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she nodded. You have passed. Jake let out a breath of relief. Good, because I really didn't want to go back in there. Kestrel's glowing patterns flickered in amusement. Few do. As Jake sat down to rest, he realized something. This trial had been different. The first two had tested his body, his ability to survive and fight. But this one, it had tested his spirit. And as he looked at Kestrel, he saw something in her gaze he hadn't seen before. Respect. Maybe, just maybe, he was getting closer to proving himself worthy. Jake Carter stood at the edge of the obsidian pillar, looking at the alien stars above him. The trials were over. He had faced fire, battle, and the shadows of his own mind. And yet, the hardest part was still ahead. Behind him, Kestrel stood tall, her glowing golden eyes watching him. Her bioluminescent patterns shifted in slow, unreadable waves. The High Council awaits, she said. Jake sighed. Yeah, I figured. The Exalvoran High Council, the rulers of this world, had summoned them. It was time to decide what came next. Would Jake truly be accepted, or would this all have been for nothing? The judgment of the High Council. The Grand Hall of Trials was massive. Towering stone columns reached into the sky, etched with the history of the Exalvoran people. The air hummed with an unseen energy, a weight of tradition and power. Jake stood in the center, facing a circle of elders. They were tall, imposing, their glowing patterns shifting with deep wisdom and authority. Kestrel stood beside him, her posture strong and confident. But Jake could tell this moment was important to her too. An elder, his patterns glowing a deep crimson, stepped forward. Human, he said, his voice like a distant rumble of thunder. You have walked the path of the trials. You have endured. You have fought. You have faced your own weaknesses. Jake nodded. That's right. The elder's golden eyes narrowed. And yet, you are not one of us. Jake held his ground. I know. The elder turned to Kestrel. And you, warrior. You are bound by the ancient laws. The touch of a human has placed you in a bond not yet fulfilled. Jake glanced at Kestrel. Her expression was unreadable, but her patterns flickered in a way he was beginning to understand. The elder continued. This union was not intended. The law was written in times long past. And so, the High Council must ask, does this human deserve the bond of an Exalvoran warrior? The hall fell silent. Every eye turned to Kestrel. She did not hesitate. Yes. Jake blinked. The elder's patterns rippled. You speak with certainty. Kestrel nodded. He has proved his strength in survival, his skill in battle, his mind in the path of shadows. He is not weak. Jake smirked. Wow, 2 compliments in 1 sentence. I must be special. Kestrel shot him a brief glare, but the amusement in her eyes was unmistakable. The elder studied them for a long moment. Then he turned to Jake. And you, human, do you accept what comes with this bond? Jake's smirk faded. He knew this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was a commitment. The trials had been brutal. The Exalvoran people were proud, fierce, and bound by honor. If he agreed, he would be accepting a future among them, a future with Kestrel. Jake took a deep breath. Then he looked at Kestrel and grinned. Yeah, he said, I accept. The final declaration. The elders watched in silence. Then, slowly, the Crimson Elder raised his hand. The council has decided. A deep resonating chime filled the air. The stone columns glowed with ancient symbols, and the very ground beneath them shook. The elder spoke with finality. Jake Carter, human, you are now bound by the Warriors' Pact. You are no longer an outsider. You are one of us. Jake exhaled. Ha, that's official. Keshtal turned to him. Very. Another elder stepped forward, holding a small silver insignia in the shape of a Xalvoran crest. He placed it in Jake's hands. This marks you as a warrior's mate, the elder said. Wear it with honor. Jake looked at the insignia, then at Keshtal. So does this mean we're, like, married? He asked, half joking. Keshtal's mandibles twitched. It means our fates are intertwined. Jake grinned. Sounds close enough. She sighed. You will never stop talking, will you? Not a chance. For the first time, Keshtal actually smiled. The hall erupted in a chorus of deep, resonating chimes, the sound of approval. The trials were over, and Jake Carter had won more than survival. He had found a home among the stars.